Kia ora tātou. I want to start today by telling you a story about courage. It's also a story about me. This is me in 2007. I was living and working in a remote mountain town in Afghanistan. Tensions were running high in the town. There were rumours that Taliban fighters had infiltrated the outskirts of the village. There were hints that a local drug lord wanted to scare off the international presence. And there were direct threats against a women's rights conference that I'd been involved in organising. One night, these various tensions came to a head, and our compound came under missile fire. I managed to remember the emergency procedures, make my way to the bunker, and spent the night in the bunker with my colleagues. The next morning, as I emerged from the bunker, I knew that I needed to make 2 phone calls, and one of them was going to take a lot of courage. The first call was to the man who I suspected was either responsible for bombing my compound or knew who was responsible, and I needed to call him to a meeting where I would confront him. The second call, the one that required my courage, was to my boss to say that I wasn't coping very well and that I needed help. Because in my experience at least, true courage often feels more like a cry for help than a battle cry. And courage, when it shows up, often does so in the unlikely guise of a moment of great vulnerability. But why is courage so important to me? Well, as C.S. Lewis says so beautifully in this quote, we don't have the capacity to live any of the other virtues that matter to us unless we have courage. Because what, for example, is loyalty, except loyalty under pressure? And what is the point of generosity unless we can sustain it when we're at breaking point? Every single thing that matters in your life is going to require courage. And more than that, as a society, as a species, as a planet, the scale of the challenges that we're facing right now is going to require an entire population of courageous people. But what is courage? Well, when I asked Google what courage looked like, it showed me things like this: firefighters, soldiers, paratroopers, rock climbers, images of the man alone facing some kind of physical challenge. And yet, when 3 years ago I started asking pretty much everybody I knew, what's the bravest thing you've ever done? Their answers looked more like this. They were stories of birth and death, illness, love, loss, and family. What I discovered as I asked my friends and even strangers about the most courageous moment in their life is that there's an entire body of courage which is almost entirely invisible in our popular representations of bravery, but which dominates our ordinary lives and which, perhaps more importantly, is essential to the future that we want to build for ourselves, for our families, for our communities, and for our society as a whole. So I want to talk to you about 6 kinds of courage that are often invisible but utterly essential. Before I go any further, I want to stop and ask you a question. Do you have what it takes? Do you have the courage to choose to live the life that is truthful, that is brave, and that has meaning? Do you have the courage to be a force for transformation in the world right now, to bring about the change that's needed to have the future that you want to see? It's an important question. How brave are you? The quality of your own life and the survival of our planet depends on it. So we're going to come back to it. First, I want to share some other stories of courage. Firstly, the courage to stand by our core. This is the poet Mark Nepo's definition of courage. And what does he mean? Well, I think he means people like my friend Pace, who 3 years ago, when I asked her what in her life had taken the most courage, she said that the most courageous thing she'd ever done was choosing to transition from living her life as a man to living her life as the woman she knew she really was. When she made that choice, she knew she would risk losing friends. She knew there was a chance she might lose family, but she also knew that it was the right choice for her and that she had to stand by her core and be true to what she knew was right for her. This kind of courage matters absolutely fundamentally to our quality of life as individuals, but also to our ability to support each other. So long as we're not able to stand with ourselves, we're unable to support others to stand as they are. The second most common answer I got when I asked people what the most courageous moment in their life was looked nothing like Google's image of a man alone facing a fire. The second most common answer looked more like a hand reaching out, asking for help. Why is asking for help so terrifying? From my own life, I remember a time when I needed help more than ever before. Some of you may have been in this place, some of you may not. But there came a time in my life many years ago when I had been caught in a downward spiral of destructive and incredibly negative thoughts. I'd come to a point where I saw not only that I had no value to add to the world, but in fact that my friends, my family, and the rest of the planet would probably be better off without me. And as I lay alone in bed one night, I realized how at risk I was, how dangerous the situation was. I knew that if I stayed alone and didn't reach out for help, I may not make it to the morning. And the most courageous thing that I suspect I've ever done in my life was to get out of bed in that moment, to walk out of my room, to leave my house. I walked across the driveway. I walked to my next door neighbour's house, and I knocked on my next door neighbour's bedroom window. And I said, I need help. It's terrifying to ask for help because when we ask for help, we have to pull back the curtain that we so carefully construct in front of our lives and show people just how messy things really are and just how scared we really are. But unless we're willing to show each other that we're all messy, unless we're willing to admit to each other that none of us can do this life without each other, there's no way to be in community. And both for our own health and well-being and for the health and well-being of our entire planet, we need courageous communities. So we need to ask for help. The third most common kind of courage that I heard in these stories was the courage to care. Some of you will know these stories. I heard stories of people who had held their sister's hand as they died, helping my mother move into dementia care, caring for my husband as he recovered from a brain injury, staying with my father in the last weeks before he died, falling in love again after my heart had been broken. And very, very often, people told me the most courageous thing they'd ever done was parenting. It takes courage to care. When we care, we leave ourselves open to being hurt. I have a friend, Horia, and Horia is a tiny pint-sized Afghan dynamite. She's a women's rights advocate, she's a journalist, and she has faced down warlords in Kabul and multiple death threats for people who would really rather that she shut up and stop doing what she does. When I asked Horia, what in your life has required the most courage? She told me it was the moment when she had to meet her mother's eyes and look into her mother's face after her brother had been killed in the Civil War. Why was that so terrifying? Why did it require so much courage? It's because of love. As Paulo Coelho has said, every act of courage is an act of love. And I don't think that I need to explain to you how and why our planet needs more of us to have the courage to care. The next kind of courage is the kind of courage that recently when my friend Pace revised her answer. In fact, just this week, she revised her answer to the most courageous thing she's ever done. She now says that transitioning is the second most courageous thing she's done, and it comes a close second, she says, to leaving her safe, comfortable, and cushy job in order to start her own business. And when she said that, I could relate to that because I can remember 4 years ago lying awake at night, all night, literally frozen by the terror of having opened a restaurant and having no idea if it was going to succeed or fail. When we do things that we think may fail, we are demonstrating the most extraordinary courage. There's a reason why opening the restaurant for me was more terrifying than going to Afghanistan. I couldn't fail at Afghanistan. I mean, how was I going to succeed at Afghanistan? As long as I went and I came home, that was that. But I knew that by opening a restaurant, there was a very good chance, in fact, a very high chance, that I would publicly fail. The world right now needs more people with the courage to experiment, to try things, and to do things that we know might fail. But equally importantly, perhaps even more importantly, the world needs people with the courage to admit when they've made a mistake and to apologise. I asked my friend Chris, who I know largely as an adventurer, a person who has visited every single country in the world and lived in numerous dangerous places, what was the bravest thing he'd ever done? And he mentioned none of his travels. He said the bravest thing he'd ever done was to admit when he'd messed up and hurt somebody, to pick up the phone, to call them, and to say, "I'm sorry." The fifth form of courage is a form of courage which I think is perhaps the most invisible. It's the courage to be present. And what do I mean by this? What I mean is that when life is messy, when our inner life is messy, and when our outer world is messy, confusing, and scary, there's an extremely strong temptation to look away. When I was in Afghanistan and going through what was effectively a complete emotional and psychological breakdown, all I wanted to do is look away from myself, distract myself from what was going on. I wanted to drink, I wanted to take drugs, I wanted to be sexually irresponsible, I wanted to watch massive 24-hour-long Buffy the Vampire Slayer marathons, anything other than really paying attention to what was going on in me at that time. Which is, of course, why, being something of a sadist, I decided to start a meditation practice. And every morning I would wake up, and I think in a very fundamental sense, and I'm guessing that many of you have been here, in a very fundamental sense, I understood that I had to save my own life in that moment, and that the only way that I could save my own life was by having the courage to be awake and aware and present with what was really going on. So I started to wake up in the morning, I would sit on my little meditation cushion, set the timer, basically be like in excruciating discomfort for 10 minutes while my brain made up all kinds of crazy stories about me, and I kept trying to come back and over again to the breath. But slowly over time, what happened was I cultivated something of the capacity to be completely aware of who I was and what was going on, and okay with it. And I think that this is perhaps the courage that we need most in the world right now. When we look around us, when we see what's going on, when we see the challenges of something as momentous as climate change, when we find that there's a growing chasm of inequality almost all over the world, when we feel as though we're on the precipice of war everywhere we turn, of course the temptation is to look away. But right now, I believe the world needs people with the courage to pay attention. Finally, I want to honour the courage to continue, because the likelihood is that every path of courage that we choose will involve us messing up, possibly multiple times. And so I want to call on the words of Marianne Radmacher, who said, "Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes courage is the little voice at the end of the day that says, 'I'll get up and try again tomorrow.'" The courage to get up and try again tomorrow is the one that really matters. It's the one that really lasts. So, to come back to my story of courage, I opened with my time in Afghanistan, and I told you that in many ways that going to Afghanistan wasn't the bravest thing I've ever done. In recent years, I think the bravest thing I've ever done was to write a book about my time in Afghanistan. And it was a book in which I decided I would include the messy bits. I would include the vulnerability. I would include the times when I was confused and uncertain and lost, because I thought it was important to be truthful about really these people out there doing this good in the world are often, if not more messed up, at least as messed up as everybody else. And when that book went out into the world, I was incredibly, incredibly vulnerable. And it made me think of Dr. Brené Brown, who said, "Vulnerability is our truest measure of courage." So I want to come back to the question I asked you. Do you have what it takes? Do you have the courage to live the life you want to live, to be the force for change you want to be? But this time I ask you to use vulnerability as your measure. What if the times in your life when you felt most messy, most exposed, most afraid, and most vulnerable were the most courageous moments of your life? What if the times when you asked for help, when you let yourself care, or when you messed up completely and had the courage to try again were the most courageous days? What if the bravest mornings of your life were those mornings when you woke up knowing that you'd blown it, and yet you got up out of bed? And as Marianne says, try again tomorrow. Because here's the really important thing I want to say to you. Right now, the world needs more courageous people. But that's okay, because I believe that you are all way more courageous than the images on Google would have us think. So, with that in mind, with a reminder of how courageous you really are, I want to invite you to go out, go forth, and be brave. Thank you.